Chapter 13 of Abbotsford and Newstead Abbey by Washington Irving. This Librivox Recording is in the public domain. Recording by Greg Giordano. Newstead Abbey. Superstitions of the Abbey. The anecdotes I had heard of the quondam housekeeper of Lord Byron rendered me desirous of paying her a visit. I rode in company with Colonel Wildman, therefore, to the cottage of her son William, where she resides, and found her seated by her fireside, with a favourite cat perched upon her shoulder, and purring in her ear. Nanny Smith is a large, good-looking woman, a specimen of the old-fashioned country housewife, combining antiquated notions and prejudices, and very limited information, with natural good sense. She loves to gossip about the Abbey and Lord Byron, and was soon drawn into a course of anecdotes, though mostly of a humble kind, such as suited the meridian of the housekeeper's room and servants' hall. She seemed to entertain a kind recollection of Lord Byron, though she had evidently been perplexed by some of his vagaries, and especially by the means he adopted to counteract his tendency to corpulency. He used various modes to sweat himself down. Sometimes he would lie for a long time in a warm bath. Sometimes he would walk up the hills in the park, wrapped up and loaded with great coats. "A sad toil for the poor youth," added Nanny, "he being so lame." His meals were scanty and irregular, consisting of dishes which Nanny seemed to hold in great contempt, such as pillau, macaroni, and light puddings. She contradicted the report of the licentious life which he was reported to lead at the Abbey, and of the paramours said to have been brought with him from London. "A great part of his time used to be passed lying on a sofa reading. Sometimes he had a young gentleman of his acquaintance with him, and they played some mad pranks, but nothing but what young gentlemen may do, and no harm done. Once, it is true," she added, "he had with him a beautiful boy as a page, which the housemaid said was a girl. For my part, I know nothing about it. Poor soul, he was so lame he could not go out much with the men. All the comfort he had was to be a little with the lasses. The housemaids, however, were very jealous. One of them, in particular, took the matter in great dudgeon. Her name was Lucy. She was a great favourite with Lord Byron, and had been much noticed by him, and began to have high notions. She had her fortune told by a man who squinted, to whom she gave 2 and 6pence. He told her to hold up her head and look high, for she would come to great things. Upon this," added Nanny, "the poor thing dreamt of nothing less than becoming a lady and mistress of the Abbey, and promised me, if such luck should happen to her, she would be a good friend to me. Ah, well a day! Lucy never had the fine fortune she dreamt of, but she had better than I thought for. She is now married, and keeps a public house at Warwick." Finding that we listened to her with great attention, Nanny Smith went on with her gossiping. "One time," she said, "Lord Byron took a notion that there was a deal of money buried about the Abbey by the monks in old times, and nothing would serve him but he must have the flagging taken up in the cloisters, and they digged and digged, but found nothing but stone coffins full of bones. Then he must needs have one of the coffins put in one end of the great hall, so that the servants were afraid to go there of nights. Several of the skulls were cleaned and put in frames in his room. I used to have to go into the room at night to shut the windows, and if I glanced an eye at them, they all seemed to grin, which I believe skulls always do. I can't say, but I was glad to get out of the room. There was at one time, and for that matter there is still, a good deal said about ghosts haunting about the Abbey. The keeper's wife said she saw 2 standing in a dark part of the cloisters, just opposite the chapel, and one in the garden by the Lord's well. Then there was a young lady, a cousin of Lord Byron, who was staying in the Abbey, and slept in the room next the clock, and she told me that one night, when she was lying in bed, she saw a lady in white come out of the wall on one side of the room, and go into the wall on the opposite side. Lord Byron one day said to me, "Nanny, what nonsense they tell about ghosts, as if there ever were any such things. I have never seen anything of the kind about the Abbey, and I warrant you have not." This was all done, do you see, to draw me out, but I said nothing, but shook my head. However, they say his lordship did once see something. It was in the great hall, something all black and hairy. He said it was the devil. For my part, continued Nanny Smith, I never saw anything of the kind, but I heard something once. I was one evening scrubbing the floor of the little dining room at the end of the long gallery. It was after dark. I expected every moment to be called to tea, but wished to finish what I was about. All at once I heard heavy footsteps in the great hall. They sounded like the tramp of a horse. I took the light and went to see what it was. I heard the steps come from the lower end of the hall to the fireplace in the centre, where they stopped, but I could see nothing. I returned to my work, and in a little time heard the same noise again. I went again with the light. The footsteps stopped by the fireplace as before. Still I could see nothing. I returned to my work, when I heard the steps for a third time. I then went into the hall without a light, but they stopped just the same, by the fireplace, halfway up the hall. I thought this rather odd, but returned to my work. When it was finished, I took the light and went through the hall, as that was my way to the kitchen. I heard no more footsteps, and thought no more of the matter, when, on coming to the lower end of the hall, I found the door locked, and then, on one side of the door, I saw the stone coffin with the skull and bones that had been digged up in the cloisters." Here Nanny paused. I asked her if she believed that the mysterious footsteps had any connection with the skeleton in the coffin, but she shook her head and would not commit herself. We took our leave of the good old dame shortly after, and the story she had related gave subject for conversation on our ride homeward. It was evident she had spoken the truth as to what she had heard, but had been deceived by some peculiar effect of sound. Noises are propagated about a huge irregular edifice of the kind in a very deceptive manner. Footsteps are prolonged and reverberated by the vaulted cloisters and echoing halls. The creaking and slamming of distant gates, the rushing of the blast through the groves and among the ruined arches of the chapel, have all a strangely delusive effect at night. Colonel Wildman gave an instance of the kind from his own experience. Not long after he had taken up his residence at the Abbey, he heard one moonlight night a noise as if a carriage was passing at a distance. He opened the window and leaned out. It then seemed as if the great iron roller was dragged along the gravel walks and terrace, but there was nothing to be seen. When he saw the gardener on the following morning, he questioned him about working so late at night. The gardener declared that no one had been at work, and the roller was chained up. He was sent to examine it, and came back with a countenance full of surprise. The roller had been moved in the night, but he declared no mortal hand could have moved it. "Well," replied the colonel, good-humouredly, "I am glad to find I have a brownie to work for me." Lord Byron did much to foster and give currency to the superstitious tales connected with the Abbey, by believing, or pretending to believe, in them. Many have supposed that his mind was really tinged with superstition, and that this innate infirmity was increased by passing much of his time in a lonely way about the empty halls and cloisters of the Abbey, then in a ruinous melancholy state, and brooding over the skulls and effigies of its former inmates. I should rather think that he found poetical enjoyment in these supernatural themes, and that his imagination delighted to people this gloomy and romantic pile with all kinds of shadowy inhabitants. Certain it is, the aspect of the mansion under the varying influence of twilight and moonlight, and cloud and sunshine operating upon its halls and galleries and monkish cloisters, is enough to breed all kinds of fancies in the minds of its inmates, especially if poetically or superstitiously inclined. I have already mentioned some of the fabled visitants of the Abbey. The Goblin Friar, however, is the one to whom Lord Byron has given the greatest importance. It walked the cloisters by night, and sometimes glimpses of it were seen in other parts of the Abbey. Its appearance was said to portend some impending evil to the master of the mansion. Lord Byron pretended to have seen it about a month before he contracted his ill-starred marriage with Miss Milbank. He has embodied this tradition in the following ballad, in which he represents the friar as one of the ancient inmates of the Abbey, maintaining by night a kind of spectral possession of it, in right of the fraternity. Other traditions, however, represent him as one of the friars doomed to wander about the place in atonement for his crimes. But to the ballad. Beware, beware of the Black Friar, who sitteth by Norman Stone, for he mutters his prayers in the midnight air, and his mass of the days that are gone. When the Lord of the Hill, Amundeville, made Norman Church his prey, and expelled the friars, one friar still would not be driven away. Though he came in his might with King Henry's right to turn church lands to lay, with sword in hand and torch to light their walls, if they said nay. A monk remained, unchaste, unchained, and he did not seem formed of clay, for he's seen in the porch, and he's seen in the church, though he is not seen by day. And whether for good or whether for ill, it is not mine to say, but still to the house of Amundeville he abideth night and day. By the marriage bed of their lords, 'tis said, he flits on the bridal eve, and 'tis held as faith to their bed of death he comes, but not to grieve. When an heir is born, he is heard to mourn, and when aught is to befall, that ancient line in the pale moonshine, he walks from hall to hall. His form you may trace, but not his face, 'tis shadowed by his cowl, but his eyes may be seen from the folds between, and they seem of a parted soul. But beware, beware of the Black Friar, he still retains his sway, for he is yet the church's heir, whoever may be the lay. Amundeville is lord by day, but the monk is lord by night, nor wine nor wassail could raise a vassal to question that friar's right. Say naught to him as he walks the hall, and he'll say naught to you. He sweeps along in his dusky pall, as o'er the grass the dew. Then gramercy for the Black Friar, heaven sane him, fair or foul. Whatsoe'er may be his prayer, let ours be for his soul. Such is the story of the Goblin Friar, which, partly through old tradition, and partly through the influence of Lord Byron's rhymes, has become completely established in the Abbey, and threatens to hold possession so long as the old edifice shall endure. Various visitors have either fancied or pretended to have seen him, and a cousin of Lord Byron, Miss Sally Parkins, is even said to have made a sketch of him from memory. As to the servants at the Abbey, they have become possessed with all kinds of superstitious fancies. The long corridors and Gothic halls, with their ancient portraits and dark figures in armour, were all haunted regions to them. They even fear to sleep alone, and will scarce venture at night on any distant errand about the Abbey, unless they go in couples. Even the magnificent chamber in which I was lodged was subject to the supernatural influences which reigned over the Abbey, and was said to be haunted by Sir John Byron the Little, with the great beard." The ancient black-looking portrait of this family worthy, which hangs over the door of the great saloon, was said to descend occasionally at midnight from the frame, and walk the rounds of the state apartments. Nay, his visitations were not confined to the night, for a young lady, on a visit to the Abbey some years since, declared that, on passing in broad day by the door of the identical chamber I have described, which stood partly open, she saw Sir John Byron the Little seated by the fireplace, reading out of a great black-letter book. From this circumstance some have been led to suppose that the story of Sir John Byron may be in some measure connected with the mysterious sculptures of the chimney-piece already mentioned, but this has no countenance from the most authentic antiquarians of the Abbey. For my own part, the moment I learned the wonderful stories and strange suppositions connected with my apartment, it became an imaginary realm to me. As I lay in bed at night and gazed at the mysterious panel-work, where Gothic knight and Christian dame and Paynim lover gazed upon me in effigy, I used to weave 1,000 fancies concerning them. The great figures in the tapestry also were almost animated by the workings of my imagination, and the Van Dyck portraits of the cavalier and lady that looked down with pale aspects from the wall had almost a spectral effect from their immovable gaze and silent companionship. For by dim lights the portraits of the dead have something ghastly, desolate, and dread. Their buried looks still wave along the canvas, their eyes glance like dreams. On ours, as spars within some dusky cave, but death is mingled in their shadowy beams. In this way I used to conjure up fictions of the brain, and clothe the objects around me with ideal interest and import, until, as the Abbey clock told midnight, I almost looked to see Sir John Byron the Little, with the long beard, stalk into the room, with his book under his arm, and take his seat by the mysterious chimney-piece. End of chapter 13. Recording by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.